Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Christy Hagans, and I'm a senior associate with the California Institute for Mental Health, and I wanted to welcome you to the workshop this afternoon. You are here to hear specifically today about integrated crises and the opportunities with SB 82. And this workshop will provide information on the opportunities afforded to counties and community-based organizations with SB 82. So it's my pleasure actually to do a brief introduction, might be relatively long introduction, but of our two speakers today so that we can give kind of a proper acknowledgement of who they are. And our first presenter will be Steve Fields, MPA. He has served as the Executive Director of Progress Foundation, a nonprofit mental health agency since 1969. Progress Foundation provides a range of residential treatment services as alternatives to institutional care for persons with severe mental disabilities in San Francisco, Sonoma, and Napa counties in California. Mr. Fields has been involved in the development of social rehabilitation programs for over 40 years. Progress Foundation pioneered the development of acute residential alternatives to hospitalization and opened the first social model residential treatment programs for geriatric clients in the country, and the first social model residential treatment program for women and their children. Under the leadership of the Executive Director, Progress Foundation has also taken a lead role in developing supported housing for persons with disabilities. In 2009, the agency developed a community-based psychiatric emergency clinic to provide an alternative to involuntary assessments in hospital psychiatric emergency rooms. The Door Urgent Care Clinic operates 24 hours, 7 days a week, and is attached to an acute diversion residential treatment program, which serves as an alternative to hospitalization. I also want to make sure that I introduce to you Mr. Marvin Southard. Dr. Southard joined the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health as director in 1998, having previously served in Kern County, California in a similar capacity for 5 years. In his current role, Dr. Southard leads the largest public mental health system in the country, serving over 236,000 clients annually in one of the most ethnically diverse counties in the nation. He's overseen a 286% growth in the system from a gross budget of $495 million in the fiscal year of 1997-98 to $1.9 billion in fiscal year 2012-13. Dr. Southard has been recognized for his dedication and leadership with the following awards: a 2012 Distinguished Alumnus of St. John's Seminary, Camarillo, California, for his career-long service to people with mental illness and for leading the Los Angeles County Public Mental Health System to recognize and support the spiritual dimensions of individuals as part of their mental health recovery. The 2008 National Network for Social Work Managers Exemplar Award for Outstanding Achievement, the National Association of Social Workers 2006 Social Worker of the Year, California Chapter Award, the National Alliance on Mental Illness 2003 Award for Excellence in Community Mental Health Services, in recognition for ongoing efforts to build a comprehensive community care mental health system in Los Angeles County. The 2003 Tom Bradley Equal Opportunity Award from Los Angeles Metro Chapter of the American Society of Public Administration, and in 2000, the UCLA Social Welfare Alumni Association Alumnus of the Year. Dr. Southard is an executive committee member of the governing board and a past president of the California Mental Health Directors Association. He is immediate past president, board of directors of the California Social Work Education Center. He serves as the board member for the California Institute for Mental Health, the Plan of California, and the National Network for Social Work Managers. A member of the American College of Mental Health Administrators, he serves as a commissioner for LA County Children and Families First 5 LA Commission. He's a licensed clinical social worker, and Dr. Southard received his master's degree in social work from UC Berkeley and his doctorate in social work at UCLA. So please join me in welcoming both of our presenters for this afternoon.
I'll go first in order of our resume. I hope that I can be brief. Again, I'm Steve Fields, Executive Director of Progress Foundation. We're a nonprofit mental health, behavioral health provider, as the lingo has it now, based in San Francisco, Napa, and Sonoma counties, but we started in San Francisco. What I want to do in my portion of this workshop this afternoon is talk a little bit about programs that we developed in San Francisco that are in a way antecedents to the legislative initiative that Senator Steinberg authored to actually try to put some funding and some financing behind the idea of alternatives to the high end, the acute and crisis end of our behavioral health systems. The programs that I'm just going to mention today aren't obviously the only modalities to be used, but I want to emphasize them because I believe that they are underutilized as levels of care in our county mental health systems throughout California and certainly nationally. So I want to stimulate that conversation, and after Marv presents his LA-based conversation, we're going to leave as much time as possible to have questions and answers, either about nuts and bolts or, I hope, social policy and the politics of getting these kinds of programs up and running in our counties. Progress Foundation started as a halfway house in 1969, and I was the first counselor in Progress Foundation. I was a conscientious objector in the draft, planning to go to prison. I ended up getting alternative service possibility, and I landed in this weird halfway house that had no money and no staff, and I said, okay, I'll do this as an alternative and see what happens. I came out of the draft resistance movement. I never intended to go into the mental health field, didn't understand it, didn't have any background in it, didn't have a family member as far as I knew who had helped educate my family and what it was like to have a diagnosis. But I did come at the work from a social change perspective because that's the only thing I knew. That in English literature. I was in the PhD program at UC Berkeley at the time I was planning to go to jail. But that was '69. We're talking about the Cambodian invasion. Who can study Sir Gawain and the Green Knight when, you know, when helicopters are flying over your head because the National Guard has occupied Berkeley? I give that background because what I want to emphasize in the kinds of programs my agency has pushed is it is motivated by a desire to minimize the institutionalization of people we diagnose with severe mental illness. As I stayed in this small halfway house program, I became increasingly aware that we were conceding the early stages of intervention, connections, relationship building, and everything else in the most volatile, labile, and actually creative stage of a psychiatric experience to the high end of the system. And everyone was waiting for them to come out of hospitals and come out of institutions, and then we were supposed to teach daily living skills, how to cook, how to vacuum. You know, most of my staff in the early days didn't know how to cook or vacuum, so it seemed a little presumptuous to be assuming we were going to teach people with severe mental illness, something they actually did quite well, many of them. But, so the perspective that I brought to my work was a systemic one. It seemed to me early on that if we didn't find a way to stem hospitalizations, we were always going to be dealing with the after effects of hospitalizations. Not that hospitalization in itself was a toxic experience, but that if it's the introduction to the mental health system for most people, it sets up, from my point of view, the wrong directional valence for how we decide to look at the possibility of recovery, the possibility of not necessarily being diagnosed the rest of your life, the possibility of not having to accept limitations on what you can do, because in early conversations, even in an acute phase, individuals are susceptible to being treated like humans, being treated like people with dreams, being treated like people who want to hear practical solutions and not medications only and diagnosis only. So that's why when I took the original halfway house model I decided that what I wanted to do was stop people from going into the hospital. In 1978, Progress Foundation opened what I think was the first what we called an acute diversion program in the country in a public mental health system. In a residential setting that was normalizing, and it's on a street where if I told you where the house was, you wouldn't, or the address or the block it was on, you wouldn't be able to pick it out. Using the principles we'd learned working in the halfway house model, intensifying it and building a social relational environment that was meant to intervene, have relationships intervene in place of the necessity to always use medications only or just to tap down the symptoms before you started working with folks. La Posada, the first program we opened, the crisis residential program under the rubric of Medi-Cal, we opened it in 1978. And since then, Progress Foundation pretty much has gone on to look at where is there a risk of an institutionalized population in our public mental health system, and what community-based analog can we develop along the lines of we didn't know we were ahead of ourselves, recovery. We called it social rehabilitation back then. But what kind of community-based analogs can we develop that can serve a majority of the people who are currently being institutionalized, but do it in a different way, do it in a more normalizing, community-based, familiar, intentional community approach to treatment. And I got to say, when I proposed the program in San Francisco, the only way we got to do it is we got to do it in the Mission District. I've found that if you experiment in minority communities, you have a much better chance of doing creative things than if you're not. And so we had the support of the Mission community to do something other than just inpatient, and we developed this program. What we learned when we did that program early on, when we did La Posada, was at the time we had the catchment areas. I go back so far, it's like I'm back in medieval times, so some of you can look this up online. I know the veterans are nodding their heads, but the Mission District catchment area had a hospital that was a private hospital that had gone out of business, and they were looking for beds. And the intention of San Francisco Mental Health was to buy all the beds at San Francisco General. Well, as odd as it may seem, back then, San Francisco General did not have any Spanish-speaking therapists as part of their treatment teams at their inpatient units. They used consultations. It's kind of disturbed the community in terms of some basic ideas that if you're talking about what someone's saying to you, in order to diagnose them and decide what they need or how out of the bounds of normal behavior they may be, it helps to be able to understand what they're saying. So they came to us and said, will you do half of these beds in a community program? I said, I've been waiting for this for a long time, wrote a proposal. The most serendipitous part of that proposal is the community-based emergency service was also up for grabs. And we got the county-based crisis services in our alternative to hospitalization on the first floor. I'd like to take credit for that one, but I can't. It was just by chance that this opportunity came up. And what we learned from that is the kind of resistance that would be present in most innovative, sometimes seemingly kind of goofball proposals of doing acute care in a house in the community, you need a practical logistic support system, and that became the crisis team downstairs. If they had to get someone 5, 8 blocks away to get them into San Francisco General, but if we would take them in our house, they were off the hook. So we got referrals we never would have received if we had to wait for them to come to us from San Francisco General Hospital. They'd have said, those kooks, what are they doing? Trying to do acute care in a house, you know? And so we got a chance to prove ourselves right away out of the gate that we could work with individuals that nobody thought could be treated outside of an involuntary setting because people hadn't tried to do it before. We worked with people who were refused to go into the hospital. Might have been the sanest part of the experience they were having, but it was viewed as part of their pathology. But when they saw La Posada, went upstairs, sat in the dining room instead of in a fluorescent lit interview room, saw other clients in the building in their own clothes, were interviewed by a counselor who spoke their language, they would say, I'll stay here, but I'm not going to the hospital voluntarily. So we were able to crack in San Francisco some of the resistance to these ideas we get, that there's somehow some static set of people who need involuntary hospitalization, who can't be in the community. And we all know that that's a subjective shifting line. So that was the experience that kept me in the field. I said, this is kind of fun, you know, and who knows what we can do with this kind of an idea. The point that I wanted to make, that I want to make about that experience is, what it led us to do was to concentrate more fully on what's really the challenge in doing acute crisis care in communities, which is what kind of a crisis response system is there that exists, and how coordinated it is, and how coherent is it about what its goals are. So what we were able to do early on was model two of the key components, which are beds in the community that are acute with a crisis triage assessment working hand in hand for a change. Now, those of us who've been around in mental health systems for a while know, it didn't stay that way. They eliminated the catchment areas, and when they eliminated the catchment areas, they took the crisis team out of La Posada and put it back in San Francisco General, and we kind of centralized everything again, and we lost that lesson. The whole system lost that lesson. But they replicated the acute diversion model 3 times because it worked. You know, I've said to a number of people, I have an old friend, Wayne Clark here, you know, there are people in states around the country who know what we do at La Posada at Progress Foundation better than my own county knows. They have never asked me, how is it that you can keep taking people our only referrals are out of the crisis, psychiatric crisis room at San Francisco General. You can't get in any other way. Because we had to prove that when they said, oh, they're full, but they're not taking the people that would be in the hospital, we had to take that argument away. We had to say, oh no, the only people we take are the people you send us. And if you send them to us, you're attesting that we're the alternative to putting them in the hospital. And they actually signed a paper that said, for this clinical reason, this person is being diverted from the hospital to La Posada. So when time came for funding questions, I was able to use their own data to say, no, we're not cherry picking, we're taking everybody they send us. That's not everybody that needs to be treated in an acute episode. But what it taught us, and it taught us in San Francisco, and I've seen it in counties all around the state, who needs to be in a hospital bed is not just determined by the presenting clinical picture they have, but what the alternative is in the community. And it's one of the fundamental planning ideas behind looking at the SB 82 process. It's amazing how we describe our systems by what isn't available and put back on the consumer or the client the consequence of involuntary hospitalization because we don't have a crisis residential program. I can say comfortably here today, SB 82 offering this opportunity around the state, if you don't have in your county a fully staffed crisis residential treatment program. I don't mean a respite program where we pat consumers on the head and say, go off and we're dealing with serious issues here. I mean a Medi-Cal reimbursable, certified crisis residential program in your community. You are hospitalizing people who don't need to be hospitalized. It's just that simple. It's math. If you have a crisis service that is in the same building as the elevator ride right up to your inpatient unit, you are filling your hospital beds before you divert. Now, I'm sure there's exceptions, and I'm sure there's leadership in some counties that do a better job on this. But I'm saying as a consequence, because of the economic structures, because of the disincentives to have empty beds in hospital care, I used to joke that I used to wait for years. We had 4 acute diversion programs in San Francisco, and I'd say, I'll retire. A lot of people were waiting for me to say that. I'll retire when I can say that there are empty beds in the inpatient units and my beds in the ADUs, the acute divert, are full. I don't think there was ever a single day that happened unless it was by accident. It would seem as though the most acute people come into emergency rooms earlier in the day. And this is something that you guys might want to write something. I think we're on to something here. Acute mental illness happens earlier in the day because everyone who came in earlier in the day had to go into the inpatient unit. Then they were full, and suddenly a whole group of people started showing up who could be diverted. That was literally one way to interpret all of the data. We would get our referrals late in the afternoon when the hospital was out of beds. So either there's something going on here where mental illness is an early day phenomenon, particularly at its acute phase, or we need to look at the patterns that our institutions use and our services use to decide how we triage intelligently to use our acute beds, which are a precious, expensive resource, in the most practical way. Residential treatment and acute diversion level, the ones that we run in San Francisco, which is a high-cost city, are $380 to $400 a day. Our inpatient unit is probably, they say, $2,500. I think it's closer to $3,000, $3,500 a day. It's a teaching hospital. If they gave me everything I wanted to do an acute diversion program, these are 10 and 12 bed programs. They're residences. I couldn't drive the cost over $420 a day. They are one of the most practical, financially intelligent, stretching your resources strategies that we could use, and it's one of the most underutilized level of care in the state of California, and California is better than the nation. So the last thing I'm going to say, so that I get into this, I have a weak version of this, so I'm what day am I on now? The last frontier for us was to try and divert from the emergency room because of the phenomenon I had mentioned earlier. Now, if we had a unified system, if we had a managed care system where the same organization that was running the alternatives was also the access point to hospitals, you wouldn't necessarily have to have all these barriers. But because we're so fragmented in our systems and balkanized, that, you know, there are some counties where the inpatient unit is even controlled by the mental health, behavioral health division. So the kinds of policies you need to have a policy of diversion always runs into the politics of government structures. But so what we had to do, I said, I got to keep people from going into the emergency room because that's the feeder into the hospital. And so we said, well, you know, back in '78, we had a community-based emergency service that was actually in the acute diversion program. And it was more advantageous to divert when they were right in the building. So I took to the mental health director at that time a proposal to open a community-based stabilization unit that would divert from San Francisco General Hospital. I had a health director who was a creative, risk-taking guy some of the time. And on this one, he was so frustrated with the number of admin days in our hospital beds, people who didn't need acute care who was still there, he said, yeah, let's cut off the customers. So we opened a crisis stabilization program in the community. But the important thing was this time I insisted that there be an acute diversion program attached to it because I needed to replicate the model I was trying to create an alternative for. If I just had a stabilization unit in the community but no beds, well, when that 22nd, 23rd hour when they have to leave comes up and you don't have a place to send someone who's still very acute, they go back to the hospital anyway. So we have 14 acute diversion beds in the same building so that if someone doesn't clear enough to go back to their situation, instead of having to hospitalize them, they can go into our ADU, or because we run the stabilization unit, one of our other 3 ADUs with priority access. And I think what Marv's going to be talking about in part is this is a kind of practical building experience of building a coherent system of crisis services that work together to divert whenever possible, rather than depending upon independent operators coming to agreement on protocols and who can get into what. We can control who goes to our acute diversion programs out of this. Now, interestingly enough, the biggest supporter when we put it forward, it could be a quiz question. There were one people who were threatened and took nothing but shots at the proposal to do a community stabilization unit, and there was one group that loved the idea. The police loved the idea because they hated taking people on a 5150 to San Francisco General. They couldn't park. They had to go in and start filling out paperwork. The frenzy of the place drove them crazy. The street to them was a more natural, calm place to be than a psychiatric emergency service. And so they said, look, they said to us in a meeting, 40% of the people we transport to San Francisco General and 5150 don't need that. But if you don't have anywhere to take somebody at 12 o'clock at night on a Friday where they need immediate, structured, high-level, professional intervention for their crisis, once again, you go to one of the most expensive services in the whole system because you don't have another alternative at that high end of an acute crisis. So we opened a voluntary crisis stabilization unit, meaning the police can bring people there. They bring them in the front door. We say to the individual, will you stay here? If they say yes, the police leave. We have had 4 people in 5.5 years not be willing to stay and needing the police to turn around again and take them back to PES. I'm telling you, and people who know the politics, if we'd have had 4 people in the first week, the police would have bailed on us. They would say, another crazy idea, it didn't work for us. But what we've demonstrated is there's a huge portion of the population that is being served in the most expensive and least calming environment because we don't develop first-level alternatives for people to voluntarily engage, and they do. So Darrell Steinberg actually had visited our acute diversion programs when he was working with the commission on setting up the process for Prop 63. And when I told him about the next iteration of this, he was excited by the idea because Darrell got pretty sophisticated on community-based mental health stuff. And this idea of having a more accessible emergency service that's in the community, not in a bunker somewhere, but in a place where people could actually feel they could go there and not risk their freedom, was an important one for him to see, and I was really pleased to see it got embedded as one of the many things that's being promoted under the SB 82 process. So what I want to leave this afternoon part in my advocacy is people looking not just at the modalities everyone knows about, mobile crisis. I could do mobile crisis workshop too, but I won't go into that. Acute case management services. You know, all of the things we're used to, but looking at community-based analogs that help us replace the necessity to use our most expensive and diminishing resources. When we know the technology is out there, we know it can be done, we have experience of it being done, and we ought to be taking advantage of this opportunity to build toward that capability. So. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. So that's what I was going to do today. If you have PowerPoints, it goes faster because your PowerPoints go faster than you do. But Marv.
I wanted to thank Steve. I think giving that vision kind of will make my presentation go easier. And I'm going to, if I can turn this on, put a timer on so I don't go on too long, because really I think the most valuable part of this will be the dialogue, because I think all of us here are trying to create a community responsive system in kind of the ways that Steve was describing, and yet we have to find the financing and the resources to get it done. So my presentation is going to be, I'm going to just do a real quick run through of a PowerPoint. The first part of the PowerPoint will be just about SB 82. Most of you know that already. I'll just touch on that. Then I'll describe very quickly the current LA crisis response spectrum of care, because understanding what we're proposing on adding makes most sense if you know what we already have. And then I'm going to describe the concrete proposal that the way we want to use SB 82. But the bulk of the time I hope to spend on the last slide. And the last slide talks about the implementation obstacles that we have encountered and some of the creative opportunities that we think SB 82 will create for us. And it appears, oh, there it goes. So anyway, I'll start here. You know, SB 82, I think the two components are the $142 million statewide for the capital development with a little bit set aside for mobile crisis response. LA County got about 40 million of that. And the triage personnel, that is 32 million statewide unmatched. The 32 million unmatched is important because if you do 32 million statewide and try to create the number of positions they expect you to create, you're breaking the minimum wage laws. So the only way to get it done is if you do some reasonable matching. So currently our crisis response continuum includes field operations, law enforcement, mental health teams. We have various flavors of those with LAPD, sheriff, several with Burbank, Long Beach, Pasadena. Slightly different arrangements in different places, but wildly successful. Greatly appreciated by law enforcement and very effective in a variety of difficult situations, including barricade situations, all the high-end things. We also have, like everybody does, PMRT, Crisis Response 5150 teams that operate 24 hours a day. And then we have other specialized crisis teams for threats of school violence, for critical incidents and emergencies involving high-profile individuals, prevention activities where we follow people who may present serious threats in combination with risk assessment teams with federal, state, and local government. So those teams also are a part of our overall portfolio. For alternate crisis services, we have urgent care centers that we have evolved kind of in the way that Steve was describing. Some of them are intimately connected with a hospital, not necessarily a county facility, but with a hospital, just in case somebody who comes in or is brought in ends up having a physical health condition that is acute. If it's a brain bleed instead of mental illness, we need some kind of protection for that. So we have always a close connection. These, again, have been wildly successful. They have diverted a great number of folks who didn't need to be in hospitals. And I'll just say, as Steve indicated, it only works when the urgent care is connected to a network of community agencies that are capable of dealing with the individual's problem after 23 hours. So those may be housing programs, they may be outpatient intensive programs, they may be substance abuse programs. You need them all as kind of like a feeder network. And those programs only work if they're embedded in their communities. We also have homeless outreach mobile engagement teams in various flavors. The most adventuresome of those is the joint mental health, substance abuse team, where they go out, act together, and sometimes it's the physical health that provides the thing that the person wants and needs, and through that they're able to be engaged in their mental health or substance abuse issues. So we also have residential services. We are very underserved in the area of crisis residential programs right now. What we do have are what we call IMD step-downs, which are residential programs for very acute people who in years past we would have tried to keep in IMDs, but there's not enough room in IMDs. We found out the right kind of residential program with the right kind of support can provide good outcomes. So this is what we are planning to do. We are planning to add 4 more urgent care centers, adding to the 4 we already have, so that we'll have an urgent care center in each of the 8 service areas in LA County. We've divided LA County into various regions for service delivery. They range in population from, say, 800,000 to about 1.8 million is the size of the various regions. The target population for them will be exactly the kind of people that Steve was talking about. Our hope is that we would find people who would voluntarily come to them, but we have also found that it is useful to have them set up in such a way that police can bring people on a 5150 there, and they can be triaged to see if they need a full 5150 in the context of the 23-hour setting, and then appropriately moved where they need to be after the 23 hours. And we found less utilization by the community if we don't have at least that capacity. So the second part of the capital development is our crisis residential programs. We're hoping to create 560 additional beds to add to the 34 that we currently have. Obviously, this is a major expansion, and the kind of facility that we're trying to create is exactly what Steve was talking about. We believe that we have an interest in most areas of the county to provide this kind of service, and we have some providers that are willing to do it. The board was interested in knowing exactly where these would be located, and at least in LA, it's to make sure that they get their fair share rather than that they're located in somebody else's district. So we had to use an index of relative need and population to make sure that the distribution was politically acceptable as well. So we embedded that in the plan as we proposed it. Mobile crisis support, we're adding additional personnel for new partnerships with law enforcement. The largest number of those will go to LAPD because I made a rash promise to LAPD a few years back, which is I told them I would match a clinician to every cruiser and law enforcement officer they could identify for the joint teams. They end up loving our program, which they call SMART, so much, they outstrip my ability to fund clinicians to match their officers. So 5 of these new things will go towards fulfilling our promises to LAPD, and 5 of them will go to the Sheriff's Department, and 5 of them will go to other jurisdictions in the LA County, probably in smaller cities that currently don't have any law enforcement mental health teams. Triage personnel. The triage personnel, as you all probably know, are supposed to be the glue that helps link people to the programs that we're developing. And in LA County, we're proposing to do half of them through community agencies through contracting, and about half of them through county directly operated workers. And we have 4 different kind of flavors of these triage teams. One of them will be forensic, and their job will be to link people coming out of the jails into the community programs that the jail population needs, whether that's health, mental health, or substance abuse, and also to do the same thing with the AB 109 population. And those teams will be contracted out to the network of providers that are already doing our AB 109 work, because we have a good relationship, good outcomes with our AB 109 providers. Second category will be a group that will be working with foster home stabilization, because in many cases we were called to do 5150s for kids in placement crisis at a foster facility of some sort, and it was a relationship disturbance, not a mental illness, that was the issue. And it was a really bad thing for the child, for the system, to hospitalize somebody for something like that. And yet, we don't like, at least in LA County, to just say no to our Department of Children and Family brothers and sisters, because they're under a lot of pressure. So the model here would be people who could go in, not do 5150, but stabilize the relationship or the placement issue there, and so that's the second flavor. The third flavor will be dealing with what is right now one of our biggest crises in LA County, which is all of our hospitals and all of our psychiatric emergency rooms are full and overflowing. So right now the issues aren't how can we keep those beds filled, it's like how can we keep things manageable in our whole hospital because the demand is so great. And so this flavor of triage workers' responsibility will be to try to move people from emergency rooms of all kinds, from all kinds of hospitals, into the urgent cares, and move people to from the urgent cares into the community programs like the crisis residential programs. So they're a component of the glue. And then the final group that will be run by directly operated programs in our county is the homeless outreach, veterans outreach, and these are going to be a geographic addition to the navigator kind of programs that we currently have, the outreach programs that we currently have funded with MHSA. So that will just give us a greater capacity to do that kind of work that we already, and most of you already have going. So that's the triage personnel. So this was the rationale for the urgent care centers. I don't think I need to go into that. I think it's pretty obvious when you've got a system that is already overflowing and you get at something that can reduce the need for your most expensive and impacted resource, you use it. And urgent cares have done that. We just don't have enough of them yet to do it to the degree that we need it done, so we're adding more. I think Steve gave the rationale already for the crisis residential treatment programs. And the mobile crisis you probably already have in almost all areas of California, an experience of how well that works and how important those programs are. Triage teams, I think each of those 4 areas that I spoke of have their specific rationale, but I think as I've described them, it's pretty much common sense what they're doing. So here's the last slide, and the one that I hope to spend most of my time on. So the challenges. The biggest challenge, of course, is inherent in the bill itself for the crisis residential and the urgent care, which is there's no operating money. So that's a great idea. We can fund the building and the acquisition and the sites, but how do you run a program after the first 3 months with no money? So this is the answer that we are trying in LA. I may tell you later if it worked or not, but so part 1 is obvious, everybody's going to do it. ACA will fund a lot of this. A lot of these folks ought to be newly eligible, and many of them will be newly eligible Medicaid expansion populations, not because they're not disabled, but because they have an addiction issue that has blocked their ability to get SSI in the past, and therefore, though disabled, we couldn't get SSI. Now with Medicaid expansion, we don't have to bother about whether their substance abuse blocks their disability, because at least their medical services are paid because for sure they're poor. So the so ACA is a part. The second part that we're experimenting with is that the current system that we have, or non-system that we have, is really impacting the emergency rooms of all hospitals who have emergency rooms. It doesn't matter if they have a psych unit or not, their emergency room is trying to cope with persons with mental illness who are there, and the days when they could just send them to Skid Row are past, thankfully. It's a big problem for the hospitals. So Dr. Shaner has been engaging the Hospital Association of Southern California in a dialogue about a donation, that the hospitals would donate into a donation fund. We tried thought of a tax, but a tax would have or a fee would have taken too long, you know. So County Council told us it had to be probably, if we wanted to implement it this decade, a donation. So we're creating this donation fund, and we're trying to convince and it can't be quid pro quo. So you can't say to a hospital, you donated so you get access to these resources, you didn't so you can't. We just have to create the resource, and then the hospitals writ large need to see it in their interest to make this donation to create this resource. So there's interest. We don't have a final commitment yet, but there is some interest in that. The third way is we're seeing if we can approach our stakeholder process for MHSA to use we have some MHSA one-time money, a pool. So our proposal is we take a portion of that MHSA one-time, divide it into 3 years, and I'll just make up a number, it's not necessarily this number, but say $5 million a year for 3 years, and have the stakeholders allocate that towards this process as a way of funding it. And the fourth way is that I made a request to this CAO for County General Fund for it. So good luck on that. But so if the CAO says no, then the ask on the MHSA side will have to be bigger. So anyway, that's the plan, such as it is. There was also a problem that arose in the triage worker issue because you know, we were assigned a certain number of positions. I forget right now how much, 200 something like that we were supposed to create out of our $9 million allocation. So as we did the math, before overhead, before benefits, it was like $50,000 a position it came to, and that's not county structure to be able to do that in that way. So we had to get creative. So and there needed to be, whatever the line worker was, there had to be some kind of supervisory structure, and we were allowed very little administrative overhead in the plan. So it's like, how are we going to really make this work? So the only way we could do it was we had a certain number of positions that are like full-time county or contract positions, and a certain number that are stipend positions where they are, because remember, these teams are supposed to be professional and people with lived experience, and so we created a stipend pool where people would participate in and receive a stipend for their participation, and those items would be counted towards our 200, and so that's how we got to the number we needed. We have some experience with doing a stipend program already. We call it our WOW workers, and it is wildly successful. The clients really love it, that experience of doing that kind of work, and it's kind of a bridge for them until they can feel they have enough security to give up their SSI and get a full-time job and so forth. So the concept works. We did get some pushback from the client community that we were like giving them lesser tier jobs and not what they had been hoping for. But, you know, we explained that's the only way we could do it. It was do that or not apply for the grant, because there was just no way to get it done otherwise. So the two biggest opportunities that I see about putting together the system in this way, the biggest one was spoken of kind of in the last presentation from Santa Cruz County, which is a pre-booking diversion program. But the pre-booking diversion program that we have in mind is something that is currently operational in a number of jurisdictions, but probably most prominently Miami-Dade County. And the idea there is for law enforcement, when they run into any of these minor crimes, where it's a real crime that's been committed, not the outreach that that some of the presentation in Santa Clara was about pre-booking diversion, but an actual crime which the officer in other circumstances might have arrested the person for. In this case, instead of arresting the person, the individual would be brought for triage to one of our urgent care centers, and then if they chose to accept treatment in that context, there would be no arrest, there would be no booking, there would be nothing on their record at all, saving a whole host of law enforcement costs, but also saving the individual's record yet one more arrest, which is a bad thing for your record even if you're not convicted or charged. An arrest lessens your future chances for things. So we're hoping that that gets operational, but if we just had the urgent care centers, they would be overwhelmed. So we have to have the crisis residential programs also available, but also, and this isn't today's topic, but I always talk about it anyway, which is the true honest-to-God implementation of the drug Medi-Cal benefit for crisis residential programs, because that's the other piece of this. If we had these programs and real crisis residential programs available, then that would make everything about this pre-booking diversion program much more likely. So it's gotten a lot of traction. We got the district attorney from LA County to take the lead on the planning, so it's a law enforcement, not a mental health effort, even though it was our idea first. We gave it to them. They've engaged the courts on it. We have regular meetings a couple times a month on it, aiming towards a community summit that we got the California Endowment to fund for the end of May. And we've also engaged the Gaines Center from back east to be the consultants on putting together a community-wide pre-booking diversion program, because besides having our mental health infrastructure, which AB 82 I think will allow us to create, it also depends on the ability to train law enforcement to recognize and do the right thing. And so Judge Leifner from Miami-Dade, who first introduced to me this idea, said the profound change was a change in the culture of law enforcement in Miami-Dade, where instead of being a badge of honor to arrest somebody, it became a badge of honor not to arrest somebody with mental illness, but instead to divert them. And so they would go to extreme measures to do all kinds of creative things to avoid having to make an arrest. And that change has permeated the whole attitude of the law enforcement towards the mentally ill in that jurisdiction. So anyway, that's what he says. So that's a hopeful thing. The other issue is Los Angeles, like some of other counties, may be implementing a Laura's Law. So if we're going to implement Laura's Law, and again, Dr. Shaner led a wide collaborative group that included the strongest proponents of Laura's Law as well as the strongest opponents of Laura's Law to get together, drop their preconceptions and their fantasies about what the law, they thought the law said, and go through a careful analysis of what it actually says. And what it actually says is really something not as horrible as the opponents fear, but not as aggressive as the proponents would hope for. So, but if we were going to do a Laura's Law program, besides all the, all the other issues, how would we do it in the world? If we had these teams and they were writing these quasi-holds or whatever they are, where would they go? And again, the answer would be, it would need to be someplace like the urgent care centers. These urgent care centers would need to be available countywide. Those urgent care centers would need to be connected to a network of community resources, because in my view, the only way that Laura's Law works is if Laura's Law operates as a very strong engagement process and not as involuntary treatment. And after our team visited Nevada County, that's what we were told it operates, so that the vast majority of people choose to participate in that process. But if they choose and there's no place to take them, no place to house them, it won't work. So we're thinking that this SB 82 gives us the ability to implement Laura's Law in a way that helps the community if our board ends up deciding to do that. So, and then secondly, the pre-booking diversion, which we know everybody in LA at this point wants to do, it makes that move from a theoretical possibility to something that we might actually be able to do, and not be the spoil sports of the party and say, yes, it'd be great to divert people, but we have no place available to divert them to. So for these reasons, we're trying to be as active as possible with our stakeholder group and with the Board of Supervisors to find ways to get the operating funds identified. Another thing that I just didn't mention so far that is, I can't emphasize enough the political importance of in Los Angeles, and I think it's probably true statewide, is the decompression of the emergency rooms. Too many people with mental illness in emergency rooms, particularly emergency rooms of hospitals that don't have psychiatric units, make us look like the bad guys who aren't doing our jobs by providing people the services that they need. And it's a huge political liability, and trying to explain why we can't is really hard, given the acuity of the need. So having these programs available so that we actually have an alternative will be worth whatever blood, sweat, and tears, in my view, we have to go through to make it come true. So Senator Steinberg could have made it a little easier for us if there were some ongoing funding attached, but my summary is that nonetheless, this is a transformative opportunity for the public mental health system in California, and it deserves every creative trick all of us can come up with to take advantage of this opportunity. So I'll stop there and let's talk. Steve, why don't you come up and then... Wait.
Marvin, Steve, we've found in Northern California now, here in Southern California, that the compression of the emergency rooms is quite widespread over the last year or so. Any explanation of why you think that's happening across the state?
Well, I mean, you could probably, and you guys know as well, I mean, one factor has been the diminished funding base for services that just pushes people in directions where, because they can't get early intervention possibilities, they end up coming to the attention of law enforcement. In San Francisco, the emergency room, that's where they take people when San Francisco General was on diversion and couldn't accept anyone anymore. I might add that we had an early CHAFA version with our urgent care center. Our stabilization thing I mentioned is an urgent care center. It's the same thing, interchangeable. But the hospital council in San Francisco gave $800,000 to this to build it out. It was an early CHAFA grant to do the part we couldn't get. We had no problem getting the ongoing funding. We were having trouble with the capital part because they saw this as an increasing problem in their own settings. So, I mean, I think Marv, probably dealing with it every day, knows what some of those phenomena are, but clearly there's been a large push in the statewide hospital associations to take a look at this problem, which then sometimes leads to a critique of the mental health system's inability to serve these individuals.
Can I comment on that as well?
Sure. The question is the overcrowding of the psychiatric emergency rooms and emergency rooms with mental health patients is growing acute. Anybody have an idea why? I will ask Dr. Edwards to give his idea.
I've done emergency psychiatric medicine for about 35 years, and one of the most important factors recently is methamphetamine.
Well, good. I mean, the reason I was going to say I don't think for LA County's experience, Steve, it's that, because we've been expanding our early services significantly, and yet we still have the problem, and Alan's guess was going to be mine, is that it was that not just the immediate, but the lingering effects of methamphetamine end up making people present in ways that they might not otherwise have done. Mary? Oh, Vic.
I just want to comment relative to that your strategy, I think, is going to address that clogging in ER rooms. And in San Joaquin County, we had a chance to sort of jumpstart the process in some respects, for a county that's much smaller than LA, of course. Our population is approximately 700,000, so we have 37 crisis residential beds and 16 chairs. So that helps a lot in terms of creating alternatives, because what we do is we have a policy responding to, I think, 7 ERs in our county pool within a couple hours of being asked, which is pretty quick. And we people out as quickly as possible because of just what that phenomenon we all are recognizing. It's just not what ERs were meant to do. And God forbid we had a loved one waiting in an ER to receive and couldn't because of a psych patient.
So for the tape, Victor Singh was saying that in San Joaquin County, they already have a significant program available in their county, like the one I was describing we were trying to create for LA County, and the results of that in their demographics have been very good.
Very similar, very similar. Our application to CHAPA was to increase our, we call it 23-hour beds, or urgent care beds, from 16 to include an additional number for voluntary adults. So even though our 16 urgent care beds are 72-hour initially, or voluntary, but because we're so pressed, they're usually almost always 72-hour holds. But we found it's amazing once you have a 23-hour facility and then staff have to make a decision about where to go from there, how quickly a hold can be broken appropriately. They get out of the mindset of everybody stays 72 hours and we discharge them before we discharge them. So that was another phenomenon we saw. So another piece that we're going to add, because we don't have very much room for voluntary adult patients, we wanted to add just a section specifically for voluntary adults to come in. And with that, we're going to add another respite component as well. We don't have a respite care facility yet. So that would create basically an honest triage in the urgent care bed for voluntary adults, so that they didn't have to worry so much about being moved into
One thing I quickly want, the voluntary-involuntary conversation, as I indicated, is a fascinating one because of the way we sometimes tend to think it's predictable and not conditional on what's offered. I think one of the other ways in which an urgent care center, if it's one that the individuals who are in the system feel safe going to, that they like, we've had people brought to us involuntarily by the police, and that process I described to you takes place where they agree to stay. Is the real goal of an urgent care diversion for us in San Francisco was to take people who are high utilizers, who reached a point where, because most crises do not happen like that, they escalate over time. And so many places we have people in inadequately supported, staffed environments that in order to get into services, they have to meet one of the 5150 criteria. So we have targeted the highest users of the emergency room, but the first experience with us may come from the police. But the second experience, they come to us before they reach the place where the police had to pick them up. I mean, there's really, in some sense, you might argue, there's not a pent-up need for 5150s. We offer more 5150 services, people come out of the woodwork. It's a condition of an inadequate system as much as it's a condition of people reaching that state. So our real goal was to get people to cathect to the urgent care center when they knew they were falling apart because they felt they'd be treated differently there. It wasn't a door into involuntary care. And when we started urgent care, San Francisco General, I think it's another issue inherent in this deal of overflow, wherever the water will go to the emergency rooms, whatever's driving it is a phenomenon. San Francisco General's emergency room was on diversion with the police 65% of the time. 65% of the time, the police dispatchers told their officers, if you pick someone up, you can't bring them here. They were bringing them to the private ERs as the only other alternative and dropping them off. This past 2 years, in the most recent data, they are under 10% on diversion now. And I know that the urgent care clinic was a significant part, not the only reason, but it was a coordinated goal to change that pattern. It's not an accident that it's dropped. So that's another way that you get people out of wherever there's emergency care into the hospital if it's accessible. But when it wasn't accessible, people were being brought to the emergency rooms and dropped off by the police, and that's dropped significantly in San Francisco.
Mary?
I was just going to say, if you, Dr. Southard and Dr. Edwards, are correct about the compression of emergency rooms being due to methamphetamine use, you'll be happy to hear that the numbers are going down statewide and across the nation. But unfortunately, heroin use continues to rise. And that, along with other drug use, does require ongoing need for substance use disorder treatment, detoxification. And so to your point about this need for the drug Medi-Cal benefit to be available to us, I did want to mention much of what you said about what LA County is doing to a much smaller scale. We're doing also in Orange County. One of the things with ongoing funding and lack of ongoing funding, what we're doing as we look for alternatives to hospitalizations, specifically while we wait for the drug Medi-Cal benefit to be put into place, looking at options. What we can do is we're starting to think about having detoxification, dedicated beds for detox. And so even our tobacco settlement dollars that we've had, trying to shift funds. We can't use MHSA for that. We don't have any net county cost dollars, any general fund dollars for that. But we want to dedicate some beds so that as people leave our crisis stabilization unit, as we get new beds, we've got to have a place to put them. And so I encourage other counties to think about that too, because so many of our people end up in an inpatient acute bed, and what they really need is detox. And I don't know how quickly we're going to have the drug Medi-Cal benefit. So if there are things that we can do in counties, I know it's difficult, there aren't always available dollars, but I think that's going to make a big difference if there can be shifting of funds or finding other dollars to help, because that problem's not going away even if methamphetamine use goes down.
Yeah, Jerry and then Al.
Mark, did you say you know what you're getting for the CHOPA grant, from the CHOPA grant?
No, I know what we applied for.
Knowing LA County, they're one and the same.
Al?
Yeah, so very quickly, knowing the settlement between CDCR, the state, and the three-judge panel with corrections, and the emphasis to expand treatment resources to that population. Not that all the folks we're talking about here are in that population, but a lot of them are. Might not that be a source of some additional resources to help back up what you were talking about with the need for operating costs and so on, was occurring to me as you were speaking. But my specific questions have to do with what's the nature of the urgent care licensure and the residential facility licensure, and roughly how are they staffed?
So the urgent care licensure is crisis stabilization, and it's very medical in its staffing. The crisis residential program is also professionally staffed so that it's not, and actually we explored the possibility if we could do some peer run something with it, and no, it really needs to meet the licensure requirements.
You know, I do this for a living, so let me just say, there's a bifurcation of licensure of residential treatment that's an anomaly of state policy. When we all started residential programs in the early 70s, only licensure existed, and it was through Community Care Facilities Act, and it's the same licensure general thing that fits board and care homes or anything else. We've carved out as a system of treatment programs a category within licensure called social rehabilitation programs that allows for more treatment choices in an environment. But it's an uneasy kind of standoff with licensing. But certification came out of the Medicaid. Well, we actually had certification before the rehab option was introduced, but they picked up the regs for certification from that. Go to Title IX and look up crisis residential treatment, and it isn't overly medical at all. It's a social model program. It gives you the who needs to be there. There does not need to be a medical person in charge at all. Urgent care center, our urgent care centers, there's no licensure for it. There's certification for Medicaid. And that's where the standards come in. One licensed professional for every 4 people that you're treating at any one time. So we have NPs and RNs in that role for us with an overseeing psychiatrist. I have a 3-page sheet that I will leave for people that goes into more detail about our staffing and our costs for both the residents at door and the urgent care.
Well, we've, in Los Angeles, and I suppose most places, we've had this problem for a long time, so we've had a facility siting task force that's been trying to work on stuff like this ever since we got burned badly in a couple of our, just citing an outpatient clinic. We ended up, in the end, losing even our most supportive board member support for that project. So we've developed a community strategy for doing that, using the neighborhood councils or whatever as a starting point. And then we're also hoping that in this process we will start with the resources of community agencies that already have facilities, so they're already there. In fact, one of the areas is the substance abuse side has often has facilities, but no longer has funding to run those facilities, and so we were hoping to use those. The problems are really related to size, and that many of the facilities are too large for these kinds of programs. So there, as you say, there's a host of challenges, and the difficulty with a statewide strategy is all of the politics is specific, and but we can share more broadly the things we learned and the procedures that we follow in LA for that purpose.
The bad news for us is I've had a fight in every facility I've opened, even the urgent care center. I've won every one of them. The good news is I work in San Francisco, where the political process is a little more aligned with the goals of the health department. You're not running into those. But I think there's an opportunity here that we need to follow up on a policy level. There's an organization called CASRA, the California Association of Social Rehabilitation Agencies, that is an umbrella organization for residential treatment programs throughout California. And I keep trying to push them to put together a policy statement on how few programs that once they've been opened have ever been closed, so that we bring to bear on new planning commissions in county, that there's a training at CSAC on siting facilities, because when you try to educate a planning commission or a board of supervisors in front of 300, 500 angry neighbors, you're not getting anywhere. But the track record of these facilities not producing the feared results that everyone uses is overwhelming in this state. And we need to pull that together. But I would recommend anyone who's actually looking at doing something, and the counties they work with, contact CASRA, find out if there's some, and get some of that data. But Marv's absolutely right. What it comes down to is local politics. And, we got to take advantage of that track record. Thousands of facilities have been opened in the face of opposition and haven't been closed because they turn out to create the problems. There's a lot of great data on property values. It's a myth that they hurt property values. There's data on that. We can get kind of that information to you.
Yeah.
I know conceptually crisis residential can be a step up and a step down based on if it's a pre or post a hospitalization. Is your urgent diversion just meant to be, because it's a different name, really just for pre-diversion, or do you also do step downs?
Yeah, you're right. We are diversion only, and I've fought for that. We're not there for a discharge from the hospital when someone's bumping up against a medical necessity, getting them discharged. We're there to prevent people from going in the first place, not to be a convenient discharge for the hospitals that could have. There have been rare occasions working with county advocates and individuals where we have taken people out of the hospital. We don't preclude it, but our goal is 95% of the people we admit have to have been certified as diversions from going in the first place. To me, that's the highest and best use of crisis residential. We have a whole series of transitional residential treatment programs as well, as Christy kind of read off. That's the appropriate place for a step down. And these are all Medi-Cal, reimbursable, highly structured. You go to Title IX and look at what governs them. They're not fly-by-night kinds of organizations, and they've been proven. So that's the level of care that's appropriate for that kind of a step down. I want to throw in also just one really quick, because I'm not a county person, but there's one other way you fund these things. You close inpatient beds and divert the money to opening alternatives. That one doesn't get mentioned often enough. The way we funded 3 of our 4, the first one, La Posada, was a community mental health centers grant from the feds. And they said, yeah, it's their money. If Progress is crazy enough to try that, let them try it. As soon as we proved what we could do, when that grant ran out, the county picked up the funding. I actually believe that this level of care is not going to get the credibility and the recognition it needs till we understand it's not an add-on to a system. It's a different way of doing work for a significant portion of the people we're hospitalizing. All the other 3 programs, my program in Napa and my program in Sonoma, were funded by a mental health decision to close inpatient beds and shift the resources. And you can imagine, $350 a day for a crisis residential, maybe $1,000 a day for inpatient. You can open 2.5 crisis beds for every hospital bed you close down. And I don't want to take that option off the table. I know it's politically difficult. Unions are involved. My agency is union, SEIU all the way, helps with the argument. But I say put that on the list too.
So I think Steve's last comment could carry us on another hour. But unfortunately or fortunately, the time has lapsed. So I want to thank you for being such an engaged and responsive audience. This has been fun, so thank you.